The fees being charged by Panama are ridiculous, highly unfair, will immediately stop.
While Donald Trump threatens to take back the Panama Canal, China is quietly building something that could make it irrelevant. A massive $100 billion railway stretching 3,000 kilometers across South America. The Panama Canal moves $270 billion worth of cargo every year. That's 40% of all US container traffic squeezed through a 50-mile bottleneck. But here's what the shipping industry doesn't want you to know. The canal is breaking. Last year was the third driest in its 110-year history. Water levels in Gatun Lake dropped so low that canal authorities had to slash daily ship transits from 38 to just 22. Ships waited weeks. Companies paid millions in delays. Some gave up entirely and sailed around Africa instead. Climate change isn't just threatening the canal's future, it's destroying its present. And while Panama scrambles to build a $1.6 billion reservoir to secure water supplies, China saw opportunity where others saw crisis. In November 2024, Chinese President Xi Jinping stood on the shores of Peru and inaugurated something extraordinary, the Chancay Megaport. This $3.5 billion facility isn't just another harbor. It's the Pacific gateway for China's most ambitious infrastructure gamble since the Belt and Road Initiative began. The numbers are staggering. Chancay can handle ships 70% larger than anything Panama allows. It cuts shipping time between South America and Asia from 35 days to just 23. For Chinese companies importing Brazilian soybeans and iron ore, that's game-changing efficiency. But the real masterpiece isn't the port itself, it's what China plans to connect to it. Picture this, a transcontinental railway snaking 3,000 kilometers from Brazil's Atlantic coast through the Amazon rainforest to Peru's Pacific shores. This bioceanic corridor would link Brazil's agricultural heartland directly to Asian markets, bypassing the Panama Canal entirely. The project's scope is breathtaking. Chinese state railway officials have surveyed 4 Brazilian states, mapping routes through Mato Grosso, Goiás, Rondônia, and Acre. They're planning to connect existing Brazilian railways, the West-East Integration Railway and Central West Integration Railway, extending them through virgin Amazon territory to reach Peru. The economics are simple. Brazil exports $350 billion annually, with over 1/3 destined for China. Current routes force Brazilian goods through congested Atlantic ports around Cape Horn, or through the increasingly unreliable Panama Canal. This railway would cut transit time by 10 days and reduce shipping costs by billions. Xi Jinping himself endorsed the project during recent diplomatic meetings, specifically mentioning it as an alternative to Panama. The Chinese leader expressed concerns about geopolitical uncertainties created by Trump's threats to reclaim the canal. When the world's most powerful communist leader starts questioning American control of global trade routes, you know the game is changing. For Brazil, this railway represents more than infrastructure, it's economic independence. Brazilian Planning Minister Simone Tebet revealed that Chinese officials are very interested in helping Brazil crisscross the country with railways. The subtext is clear. China wants to reduce its dependence on American-controlled shipping lanes. The railway would traverse Brazil's Matopiba region, which produces 75% of the country's soybeans and corn exports to Asia. Imagine millions of tons of agricultural products flowing directly from farm to Pacific port without touching a single American-controlled choke point. The project builds on existing infrastructure investments, totaling 2,415 kilometers of track already under construction. But the Amazon extension, the piece connecting Brazil to Peru, remains the most challenging and expensive segment. Crossing the Amazon isn't just an engineering challenge, it's an environmental and political minefield. The Brazilian government has already modified routes to avoid indigenous territories and minimize forest disruption. Environmental groups acknowledge railways cause fewer impacts than highways, but they're watching closely. Indigenous communities remember what happened during previous Amazon developments. Entire ecosystems were destroyed for projects that ultimately served foreign interests more than local communities. This time, the stakes are even higher because the railway isn't just about moving goods, it's about shifting global power. The route avoidance strategy speaks to Brazil's careful balancing act. President Lula wants Chinese investment but can't afford environmental backlash that could derail the project entirely. Every kilometer of track must navigate this political reality. This railway is more than infrastructure. It's geopolitical chess at the highest level. China is building alternative trade routes precisely because it recognizes American control over Panama as a strategic vulnerability. If tensions escalate between Washington and Beijing, the US could theoretically restrict Chinese access to the canal. The timing isn't coincidental. Trump's threats to reclaim Panama have accelerated Chinese efforts to find alternatives. Beijing learned from Russia's experience with sanctions. Critical infrastructure controlled by adversaries becomes a weapon during conflicts. Peru has already joined the Transcontinental Railway project, offering an alternative trade route to the Panama Canal. Peru's economy minister is seeking high-level meetings with China and Brazil to advance the plan. For Peru, the railway means transforming from a regional player into a critical node in global trade networks. China isn't building the only Panama alternative. Mexico has revived its $7.5 billion interoceanic corridor, a 188-mile railway across the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. This project, originally opened in 1907 but abandoned after Panama's success, now offers container transfers between Pacific and Atlantic ports. Thailand is constructing a $36 billion canal connecting the Gulf of Thailand to the Indian Ocean, potentially rivaling Panama's importance in Asian trade. Even Nicaragua has unveiled plans for a $64.5 billion interoceanic canal. Though most experts consider this financially unviable, the pattern is clear. Multiple nations are racing to build Panama alternatives. The canal's monopoly on interoceanic trade is ending, and the countries that build successful alternatives will capture enormous economic benefits. Conservative estimates place the Brazil-Peru railway at $65 billion, but industry experts suggest the total cost could reach $100 billion when including associated infrastructure. This would make it one of the largest infrastructure investments in human history. Chinese state companies have the financial capacity for such investments. They've already spent over $1 trillion on belt and road projects worldwide. The difference here is strategic importance. This railway doesn't just serve Chinese interests, it fundamentally alters global trade geography. For comparison, the Panama Canal's most recent expansion cost $5.2 billion and took nearly a decade to complete. China is proposing to spend 20 times that amount on a project with potentially greater global impact. This railway represents economic warfare disguised as development cooperation. China is systematically building infrastructure that reduces global dependence on American-controlled trade routes. The Panama Canal, Suez Canal, and Strait of Hormuz, all potential choke points during conflicts, become less critical when alternatives exist. Brazilian officials expect to sign cooperation agreements with Chinese state companies during the July BRICS summit in Rio de Janeiro. The project represents one of 4 strategic pillars in the Brazil-China partnership established during Xi Jinping's November 2024 visit to Brasilia. The railway would dramatically reduce Brazil's dependence on its congested Santos port, South America's busiest container terminal. Instead of shipping through Atlantic routes controlled by American allies, Brazilian goods would flow through Chinese-operated Pacific infrastructure. Washington's response has been notably weak. While China builds $3.5 billion ports and plans $100 billion railways, America's biggest infrastructure offer to Peru was selling them used diesel trains from the 1980s. The Biden administration falsely claimed these were donations, but Peru actually paid millions for 40-year-old equipment. This disparity illustrates America's declining influence in Latin America. China offers transformational infrastructure investments, while America provides outdated equipment and lectures about democracy. For developing nations choosing between Chinese billions and American sermons, the choice is obvious. The incoming Trump administration may take a more aggressive approach, but the fundamental problem remains. America lacks the financial tools to compete with Chinese infrastructure diplomacy. Trump's threats to reclaim Panama only accelerate Chinese efforts to build alternatives. The Amazon crossing presents unprecedented environmental challenges. The railway must traverse some of Earth's most biodiverse ecosystems while maintaining environmental credibility for Brazilian politics and international markets. Chinese engineers are studying routes that minimize forest disruption, but any transcontinental railway will require significant environmental modification. The question isn't whether environmental impact will occur, but whether it can be managed acceptably. Climate change adds urgency to the project. As Panama faces increasing drought challenges, the reliability advantage of the Brazil-Peru route becomes more attractive to shippers. A railway doesn't depend on water levels or weather patterns the way canal operations do. Success would transform South American economics fundamentally. Brazil's agricultural exports to Asia would flow through Pacific routes, potentially making Brazilian products more competitive in Asian markets. Peru would evolve from a regional commodity producer into a critical trade hub linking 2 continents. The railway could generate hundreds of thousands of jobs across both countries. Construction alone would employ tens of thousands of workers for over a decade. Long-term operations would create permanent employment in logistics, maintenance, and associated industries. But the benefits wouldn't distribute equally. Rural communities along the route might see disruption without proportional benefits. Indigenous territories could face increased pressure despite route modifications. Managing these social impacts will determine the project's ultimate success. Building a transcontinental railway through the Amazon represents one of engineering's greatest challenges. The route must cross rivers, mountains, and rainforest, while maintaining grades suitable for heavy freight trains carrying millions of tons annually. Chinese engineers have experience with difficult terrain from Tibet railway construction, but the Amazon presents unique challenges. High humidity, intense rainfall, and unstable soils require specialized engineering solutions. Wildlife corridors must be maintained to minimize ecological disruption. The railway will likely require hundreds of bridges and tunnels. Amazon rivers flood seasonally, demanding elevated tracks or flood-resistant infrastructure. The engineering costs alone could reach tens of billions before considering environmental mitigation. This railway could trigger a supply chain revolution affecting every continent. If Brazilian goods reach Asia 10 days faster through Peru than through Panama, competitive advantages shift dramatically. Other South American countries would pressure for railway connections to capture similar benefits. Argentina, Paraguay, and Bolivia are already expressing interest in connecting their rail networks to the transcontinental route. This could create a continental railway system rivaling North America's freight networks in scope and economic impact. The implications extend beyond South America. African countries watching Chinese railway construction in Brazil might demand similar projects. India could accelerate its own infrastructure diplomacy to compete with Chinese influence. The railway becomes a template for reshaping global trade geography. The groundbreaking ceremony could happen within 18 months. Chinese state companies are finalizing route surveys, while Brazilian officials prepare environmental impact assessments. By 2030, the first trains could be carrying Brazilian soybeans to Chinese markets via Peru, bypassing Panama entirely. But here's what nobody's talking about. This railway isn't just about trade, it's about control. When China completes this transcontinental corridor, they'll have achieved something the United States thought impossible, a practical alternative to American-controlled global shipping routes. The Panama Canal took 10 years to build and defined a century of American influence. China's railway could be operational in 6 years and define the next century of global power. The question isn't whether they'll build it, it's what happens to American influence when they do,